Welcome to Royal Insider today. We're breaking down what really went down in Melbourne, and trust me, it got tense fast. The air in Melbourne felt heavy this week, not just from the autumn chill, but from a story flipping in real time. Just days ago, a commercial Qantas flight landed carrying two of the most talked about figures on the planet. They slipped in quietly, skipping the big royal fanfare from 2018, but that calm didn't last long. Within hours, hashtags were trending, petitions were flying around, and the Sussex soap opera rolled right back into town. But this time, the crowd wasn't cheering. They were digging, watching closely, hunting for cracks in that polished image. Music. And what they spotted was a string of moments that felt too neat, too rehearsed, and honestly a bit off, leaving people across Australia asking one blunt question: who are these people really here for? To get the full picture of the 2026 Australia tour, you have to zoom in on what critics now call the Melbourne Mirage. It's being framed as a private visit, packed with special projects and charity meetups. But once clips started spreading online, the tone shifted quick. It wasn't about one big speech, it was about a bunch of small moments lined up together, each one adding a new layer that didn't quite match the story being told. Right at the center of all this noise is one statement that blew up fast, delivered so smoothly it felt almost scripted. During a stop at Swinburne University of Technology, Meghan faced a group of students and said she had been bullied and attacked every single day for 10 years. People were shocked by this. She didn't stop there. She pushed it even further, calling herself the most trolled person in the entire world. That's a huge claim, the kind designed to hit hard and pull emotion from a generation already dealing with online pressure. But the internet did what it always does. It started checking every detail, every timeline, every gap. And once people paused to really think about it, things didn't quite line up the way they were presenting it. 10 years of daily bullying takes things all the way back to April 2016. Now, think about that for a second. Back then, Meghan was acting on a cable legal drama, living a fairly low-key life in Toronto, far from royal headlines. She hadn't even crossed paths with Prince Harry yet. So, people started asking, where exactly were these daily attacks coming from? Was it really that intense? Or was the story being reshaped to fit a much bigger narrative? Some questioned music. If this was less about sharing a real experience and more about building an image, almost like rewriting the past to fit the present. The idea of being a long-term target in the digital world, positioned in a way that supports current projects and public messaging, raised eyebrows fast. People weren't just listening anymore, they were analyzing every word, every claim, every pause. Critics jumped in quickly, pointing out that calling herself the most trolled person alive wasn't just storytelling, it was claiming a title, and not a small one either. Many argued that kind of label usually gets attached to world leaders or major global figures. Others even compared it to the Princess of Wales, who has faced a completely different level of public pressure over the years. In this whole Sussex world, context often takes a backseat to emotion, and that single line, clipped and shared everywhere, sparked a much deeper dive into authenticity. What started as one statement quickly turned into something bigger. And that most trolled claim, that was just the beginning. Because soon after, cameras picked up on a tiny detail, something so subtle most people would miss it. But once seen, it changed the tone completely. 4 years, one of the loudest complaints in the Sussex storyline centered around royal protocol, especially the old-school rule about wearing nude pantyhose. Meghan even spoke about it in major interviews, laughing it off and calling it inauthentic, like something straight out of a stiff 80s movie. She framed it as proof of how restrictive that world felt, a symbol of the kind of system she said she had to break away from. So, imagine the reaction online when she stepped out in Melbourne wearing black pantyhose. It might sound like a tiny detail at first, nothing major, but in high-level PR, details like that are never random. Every choice gets picked apart, and by wearing something so closely tied to a past complaint, it instantly raised questions that people couldn't ignore. If pantyhose once represented everything she pushed back against, then why bring them back for a so-called private visit? That's what had people talking. To longtime watchers, it didn't just feel inconsistent, it felt carefully timed, like the image could be switched on or off depending on the moment, depending on what message needed to land right then. For some, it started to look less like pressure from the past and more like a controlled presentation in the present. The royal style didn't come across as something forced anymore, but more like a look that gets picked when it adds impact. And when it doesn't, it quietly disappears. That contrast didn't go unnoticed. It leaves question hanging in the air. If even the smallest details feel this managed, then what else is being shaped behind the scenes? Because to many watching in Australia, this didn't come across as someone just being natural. It looked like someone stepping into a role, fully aware of the image and exactly what it represents. And that value is being judged in real time by a public that's clearly getting tired of footing the bill. Even though the couple says this trip is privately funded, what's actually happening on the ground looks a lot more complicated. A petition has already spread across the country, pulling in over 45,000 signatures in just a matter of days, and the message behind it is loud and clear. People are saying no taxpayer money should be used for the Sussex, full stop. Right now, Australians are dealing with a serious cost of living squeeze. Grocery prices keep climbing, mortgage pressure is hitting record levels, and fuel costs are draining family budgets fast. Music. In that kind of climate, hearing that public resources like police and security, funded by taxpayers, are being used during this visit has sparked real frustration. That gap between the relatable image and the actual lifestyle stood out. Even more during a visit to a local homeless shelter. Meghan showed up wearing a watch reportedly worth over $26,000, a piece that music costs more than what many people in that room might see in a year. It instantly caught attention. People started asking how that kind of image connects with the message being delivered in a place like that. Moments like this are exactly why critics throw around the word grifter, saying the activism can come off as staged rather than genuine. To them, it feels like building a brand around compassion without fully connecting to the reality on the ground. That perception has only added fuel to the criticism growing around this visit. And as that pressure builds, Harry seems to lean on a strategy that many have seen before, shifting the focus in a way that changes the conversation just when it starts getting uncomfortable. Every time the headlines turn negative, every time the money questions get louder, the same move shows up again: the legacy of Princess Diana. It's become a kind of shield. Their music first stop in Melbourne was the Royal Children's Hospital, a place publicly linked to his mother. On the surface, it looks like a heartfelt tribute, something meaningful and respectful. But to some watching closely, it also felt like a calculated step, wrapping himself in the memory of someone the world still deeply admires. By doing that, Harry places himself in a position where criticism becomes complicated. If people question the costs or the purpose of the visit, it can quickly sound like they're going after someone honoring his mother's legacy. That strategy has worked for a long time, no doubt. But now, more people are starting to notice the pattern, and they're not staying quiet about it. Observers pointed out how comfortable Harry seemed in front of the cameras during that hospital visit, speaking smoothly, talking about being excited for everything ahead. But that raised another question. Was that excitement about the charitable work, or was it about the high-profile sailing and rugby events lined up next in Sydney? That contrast didn't go unnoticed by those paying attention. The so-called Diana playbook is powerful, but when it starts overlapping with images of private jets and expensive retreats, it can feel a bit off to some viewers. Even the strongest emotional connection can wear thin if people feel it's being used too often or in the wrong way. That's when doubt starts to creep in. More voices are now saying that being Diana's son has turned into part of a carefully managed public identity, something that keeps the Sussex name visible and profitable in a very competitive spotlight. And once you start looking at it through that lens, another piece of the puzzle comes into focus: the Soho House connection that people have been quietly talking about for years. The so-called secret weapon in all of this is the connection to the Soho House circle, with Marcus Anderson often described as the gatekeeper to that elite network. And suddenly, this Australian tour starts to look very different, less like any kind of traditional visit and more like an exclusive membership push aimed at a very specific crowd. The timing lines up closely with Meghan's lifestyle brand launch, along with appearances at high-end retreats in Sydney where entry prices climb past $1,600, pointing to a clear and focused strategy. At that point, it stops looking like an effort to connect with the general public and starts looking like a play for influence among the elite. The focus shifts toward building a space where access becomes the real currency, where being part of the circle matters more than broad public support. That shift has created what some are calling a shadow tour, running right alongside the official royal schedule tied to King Charles. Right now, in 2026, the monarchy is going through a sensitive period of change, and some believe Harry and Meghan are using that moment to carve out their own lane, almost like a parallel court operating on a different set of rules. By showing up at universities and hospitals, the kind of places traditionally linked to royal duties, they send a message that their status still holds weight, no matter what's being said elsewhere. But there's a clear difference people are pointing out. Working royals operate under structured public funding with oversight, while the Sussex model leans heavily on media deals, book earnings, and private partnerships formed behind closed doors in exclusive settings. That contrast has become impossible to ignore. And then there's the media angle, which has been handled with sharp precision throughout this trip. One moment in particular stood out, what some are calling the chief propagandist move, involving a reporter named Paul from Channel 7. The interactions came off less like traditional reporting and more like a carefully timed, almost scripted exchange that had people seriously questioning what was real and what was being guided behind the scenes. Paul ended up getting the kind of access most reporters don't even come close to. Harry was relaxed, joking around with him. Meghan made sure to turn toward his specific camera, and the final coverage came out exactly how the Sussex team would want it: glowing, easygoing, and completely free of any tough questions about money or family drama. It didn't look accidental. It looked carefully shaped, almost like a lesson in how to guide media without making it obvious. By lifting music up friendly journalists and quietly shutting out the more critical ones, a very controlled bubble starts to form. Inside that space, everything feels positive, smooth, and supportive. But step outside of it and the tone shifts fast, and people are starting to notice that divide more clearly than ever. The Paul moment was just the surface level. Behind the scenes, there's a reputation for taking a hard line when it comes to coverage. If certain topics come up, like the legal situation involving Samantha Markle or questions about that 10-year timeline, those voices don't seem to get much access again. Instead, they get pushed aside, sometimes labeled as negative or unfair, which only adds more tension to the whole situation. That approach might work in the short term, but it also chips away at public trust over time. People across Australia are paying attention. They're not missing the difference between a natural interaction and something that feels planned. To many, that friendly moment with Paul didn't look spontaneous. It looked like a distraction from the growing number of voices backing that petition. Even the so-called candid moments are now being viewed differently, less as genuine reactions and more like rehearsed scenes in an ongoing public storyline. And then there's one of the strangest details of the entire tour, something that really caught people off guard. Despite stepping away from the Sussex royal brand back in 2020, organizers tied to this 2026 visit have still been tagging that old account in their posts, and that raised a whole new set of questions. So, is it just a glitch, or is there something more behind it? That's the question people keep asking. Some believe it's not random at all, but a calculated move to quietly keep that royal-linked brand alive in the digital world. Others see it as a slow test, checking if the branding can be reintroduced step by step, but this time under their full control. It might look small on the surface, but it hints at a much bigger strategy playing out behind closed doors. They've said many times they want privacy and a more normal life, but the way this Australia tour is unfolding tells a very different story. Every move seems tied to status, image, and holding onto the prestige institution they've openly criticized in the past. That contradiction hasn't gone unnoticed, and it's becoming harder for people to ignore. Then, there's the tone of the tour itself, which keeps circling back to struggle. Meghan talks about dealing with online bullying. Harry speaks about difficult periods in his life, and those are serious topics on their own. But when those messages are delivered against a backdrop of five-star hotels and private motorcades, the impact starts to feel off for some viewers. It creates what critics are calling a kind of luxury struggle, a version of hardship that feels far removed from what most people are dealing with day to day. They're asking for public understanding while living a level of comfort that many can't even imagine. In 2026, with rising global pressures and real financial challenges hitting everyday families, that gap feels sharper than ever. That's why this message isn't landing the same way it might have before. More people are questioning it, pushing back on a narrative that paints hardship from a position of extreme privilege, and that tension is only growing as the tour continues. The timing also adds another layer to the story. As legal issues involving the Markle family resurface in Florida courts, Meghan is in Australia strongly presenting herself as someone who has faced years of online attacks. To some observers, that doesn't look like a coincidence. It feels more like a strategic moment, shaping public perception early before more difficult headlines have a chance to take over the conversation. It's a move people say they've seen before. When the pressure builds and tough questions start getting close, the focus suddenly shifts to topics like mental health or online safety. Those are important issues, no doubt, but critics argue the timing of that pivot feels very strategic. It can make anyone asking follow-up questions look insensitive, which shuts down the conversation fast and keeps control firmly in place. As the tour heads into its final stretch in Sydney, the reaction couldn't be more split. On one side, supporters are calling every speech brave and every appearance a win, celebrating the emotion and the style. On the other side, there's a growing group of people who aren't convinced, questioning what they're seeing and calling out what they view as a misery tour with a very high cost attached. What once came across as charming back in 2018 now lands very differently in 2026. The constant smiles for the cameras and those perfectly timed glances don't feel as natural to some observers anymore. Instead, it gives off the impression of two people carefully working through a public script, staying on message no matter what. They're trying to present a story built around purpose and positivity, but critics say what's actually coming through feels repetitive, like the same themes being played over and over again without change. That contrast is becoming harder for audiences to overlook as each appearance adds to the bigger picture. The real missed opportunity here is that this tour could have been something very different. It could have been a chance to reconnect in a more grounded way, focusing purely on meaningful work, handling logistics privately, and leaving behind the more dramatic claims. Instead, Many feel it doubled down on the exact elements that create distance: the mixed messaging, the commercial angles, and the push to always be seen as the most of something. Whether it's the most talked about, the most relatable, or the most royal, that pattern keeps showing up. And now, it feels like they're not being compared to anyone else as much as they're being compared to their own past words. That's where the real tension sits. Moments like the MasterChef appearance added to that shift in perception, especially when placed next to other royal efforts happening at the same time. While different members of the royal family focus on long-term initiatives and global projects, this tour has left many people questioning what direction the Sussex story is really heading in next. The Duchess of Sussex stepping into a TV kitchen to promote a lifestyle brand has people talking. There's nothing wrong with building a business, but trying to balance global humanitarian image with product promotion creates a clash that's hard to ignore. One path leans on service, the other on visibility, and mixing both at the same time can blur the message in a big way. That tension shows up across the entire tour, which to many feels scattered, commercial, and at moments even a bit forced as it wraps up in Australia. Clips from the Swinburne speech, the shelter visit with the expensive watch, and the light-hearted exchanges with Paul are already looping online again and again. Now, the wider context is catching up fast. People are connecting patterns, questioning consistency, and looking deeper at how everything fits together in a world where details get checked instantly. They seem to be chasing a role that doesn't fully exist, and Australia became the testing ground for that idea. But instead of a big comeback, the reaction felt mixed, with many people showing clear fatigue toward the ongoing drama and constant headlines. What stands out now is how layered the public reaction has become. One part comes from their actual words and speeches, another from media coverage, then social media clips, and finally the wave of commentary that builds around it all. None of it stands alone anymore. Everything blends together once it spreads online. That's where the real challenge shows up. The more the narrative is shaped, the more people start picking it apart. Efforts to seem relatable clash with visible luxury, and carefully planned moments can come across as overly managed. By the end, this tour didn't just tell a story, it sparked a much bigger conversation that's still growing. They came to Australia hoping to reset the story, but instead, it may have revealed more than expected. What was meant to feel like a fresh start ended up looking like one of the most high-cost, tightly managed, and contradictory public displays people have seen in a long time. The so-called misery tour might be over, but the deeper dive into their narrative is only getting started. Because at this point, it's not just about a visit to Australia anymore. It's about how public images are shaped, how stories are built piece by piece, and how even the smallest detail can shift everything people thought they understood. And that's why this conversation isn't slowing down anytime soon. If you made it this far, drop a like, share your thoughts in the comments, hit subscribe, and share this with someone who needs to see it. See you on the next one.